recording of a conversation with David Knight made on the 8th of October 2014. David Knight, who writes the popular blog called Druidry and Weirdry, is an actor, a performer, a poet and a public speaker. He's one of the founding members of Pagan Pride UK. He's a member of OBOD, the Order of the Bards. And what continues is a conversation about the role of a bard here in the 21st century, the importance of the bard's role in history, as well as much more than the stereotype banality entertainer, as well as following threads of discourse. We hope you will enjoy this colloquy, and without further ado, this is my conversation with David Knight. The world is full of obvious things which nobody, by any chance, ever observes. To understand why we have bards in the 21st century, guys who, I guess, the traditional view would stand in a pub, sit there with a lute, and play a song. What is bard? Is it bardism? Is that a right word?
Bardism, bardistry, I think, is the right word. Bardistry is, as far as I'm aware, that is the right word for it. It's not a case of dressing up in hose and a big tunic, playing a lute and having a shelf haircut. No, I think it's. I mean, when you say bard nowadays, there's that kind of stereotype, isn't there? Of right, you go to some folky pub where they've got all traditional ales. Here's your pork pies over here, here's your Scotch eggs over there, and look at that. There's a bunch of men wearing jumpers, big beards. I think that's the kind of image it gives now. Bardistry in the 21st century, it's a bit of a weird one because it's one of those. To me, bardism, whether it's storytelling or whether it's playing music or both, it's one of those weird things. It's keeping the traditions going. It's keeping the oral tradition going. Bardistry is one of those things where, to be frank, it has no real place in the 21st century. We've got computers, we've got books, we've got iPods and podcasts. So why do we need bards? I think there's something very primal about the fact that you just sat in a room and you're listening to someone and they're just using their voice and they're telling a story, or they're actually being a character, actually being a person telling a story, and all you've got is that person's voice, the words going into your mind and actually taking you somewhere else, taking you somewhere different. And by primal, I mean it's that underlying sense that this is somehow familiar. It's almost like it speaks to us from years past. Have you ever been to the Viking Festival in York?
Honestly, I'd say no, but I believe I've got countless invitations.
Right, go. It's awesome. The very first time I encountered it, quite a few years ago when I lived there, and I was working for a tourist attraction at the time. And the idea was to go and advertise this tourist attraction while the Viking Festival's going on. And you went to the gathering of all these men, all these women, all dressed in costume, and it was immense. You got all these men dressed up in mail and beards and spears and shields and stuff. You could actually, for one, maybe a few moments, for 1 second.
You could suspend your disbelief.
You could.
You were in medieval England.
Yeah, you could believe you're in medieval England if it wasn't for that big van right behind them, but never mind. And then you got the women walking around in
maids, I guess.
Yeah, not wearing wimples, but those weird headdresses that ladies wore around that time. Big bustle skirts, carrying pots, and just reenacting that. And I remember hearing someone saying about they used to do longboat burning festivals as well. The idea that you actually had this big Viking longboat on the River Ouse and they set fire to it. They stopped that because of health and safety reasons. But
I can only imagine actually the length of time it would take to actually build one.
Yeah.
Is it also, in that sense, or would it even be, what is the purpose of taking perhaps a year around to build a ship, not to set fire to it and last 10 minutes?
That's one hell of a show.
I'm sure it is.
And that's its purpose, I guess. I don't know. I wasn't there to see it, unfortunately, because by that time it stopped. But the reason I bring that up is because when you've got all these men marching and you've got all these drum beats going on to keep the march going along, and they're all just calling out to all the people of York, and just the idea of that and the smell of the mud on the field and in the parks, and just the idea of a great big fire being built as well. I don't know, something stirred that in the blood, and that for me is something similar with bardistry as well. It's that underlying, to me, it's that underlying feeling that this is familiar. Having these fires, having all this stomping and shouting, and having someone talk of a story or play a tune that's old, kind of takes you, in my mind, it kind of takes you back to somewhere else, to somewhere older than now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, taking the concept of bardism and going back to being a bard and what it is in the 21st century, let's talk about, say, what a bard is. Because I guess for some people it's probably a word that they've never even come across. I would understand it as, again, a person who stands in a pub and plays a lute and just tells a story.
Yeah.
I can understand, say, maybe 1,000 years ago, perhaps not even as far as that really, the way that stories would be passed on is by a storyteller, or by, I hate to use the word chieftain, or somebody who's a medicine man, but that kind of person in the tribe or in the village or in the town who would, the way you would share history orally, is a memory. So, but memories, of course, in our human fallacy, tend to not be very good, not be very strong. I can barely remember what I had for dinner 2 days ago.
Yeah.
But if you were to order it as a song, the way that you would construct a song or be with other people, the story would become a song. Perhaps if you had a few people around a fire one night and they're talking about their ancient history or their philosophy or their ideology, and they want to pass that on to the next generation, their children who are also sat around the fire, of course it would become the song, which I guess is what's evolved into things like nursery rhymes, lullabies, those kind of stories that were once told only by oral history and now, of course, are written. Would you say that's what a bard is? They were actually a storyteller who perhaps told their story by music as a way to prolong the memory, of course, over generations?
Yeah, because when you look back into the past of what an account of a bard is, in medieval times the bard was an entertainer. So it was a mixture of storyteller, musician, poet. And if you look back further than that, if you even go into, say, pre-Roman times, the bard was actually a little bit more powerful than that, because there was an account in Ireland where the High Chief of Tara, there was something going on. They didn't quite understand what it was, and the chief summoned his druids, and he also summoned his poets. And around that time, poet and bard were kind of one and the same thing. And it wasn't his druids who actually asked what was going on. It was the poets who asked first. The druids that were there to give what possible rational explanation this could be, but it was the poets who had the knowledge of old.
By the way of oral history.
By way of oral history. So it was him who was asking what was going on, what can they do about it? And because the poets of old and the bards of old, as well as learning music and learning any story that they would needed to have learned, they also had knowledge. And when learning those stories and learning those tunes, they would have learned I wouldn't say they were hidden secrets as such, but they would have learned things about the people along the way. So what we would now consider folklore, back for them, was actually just tidbits of information that were essential.
Yeah.
But even plot devices and
I
stuff.
think that's probably a good point, actually, the way that, say, legends have been recorded, not perhaps by literal word to word, but perhaps by, certain events. So that could have just been a line in the song, I guess, based in their times on their history or their very recent history.
Yeah.
And they've told it to their children, and the way they remember it's certain phrases, certain lines. And then I guess you would then add that together to tell the story, to continue it.
Yeah.
So you have like one symbol or one word or one phrase that represented a whole series of events.
That's right, yeah. I mean, actually there was an account where the Celts nearly sacked Rome. In fact, they actually did sack Rome, and they were paid off to leave it alone, to please go the hell away, and then they took off. And there was actually a story passed down in, I think it was in the Irish tradition again, where there was a traveller from Gaul recounting that story 300 years later. And that was obviously passed on and kept on going. So I suppose you could say, as well as being an entertainer, it was also kind of the news of the people as well. One thing the bards did then that I don't think they necessarily do now, in fact, if ever, was they were the keepers of the genealogies of people. So they actually knew who...
The lineages.
They knew all the lineages, so they knew who that son belonged to, of that father, of that mother, and they knew all the family lines. And part of the oral tradition was to orate these lineages, and a very long process. The nearest thing I suppose you could even try and go with it was try and describe it, was I recently did some research on the Welsh story Cilwch and Olwen, and Cilwch goes to King Arthur's court and ends up reciting the entire of Arthur's warriors' names. Not only his Arthur's warriors' names, but also his ministers, the servants and the hand servants, the maids, everyone who was involved in the court. Just to say, right, these are all by all these names, I need you to swear to do this for me. So I would say that's probably another example of what the oral tradition was.
So the oral tradition, in that respect, then, is that much of a historian, as it is a storyteller.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was of telling stories around the time of when they should be told. So, for example, at Samhain, it would be a case of telling the story that would keep you a little bit afraid of the dark, not to scare the shit out of you, but maybe for the kids to learn.
The Doctor Who of the day.
Maybe it's not a good idea to play by the river when it's frosty. Bad idea of falling into the ice, that kind of thing. But sorry. But also it was a case of, that's the children entertained, and while they're asleep and thinking about that, I've got this news for you to tell about other tribes in this area here, and also if I tell this story, that's the history of this particular person, because we need to remember that lesson. That makes sense?
No, I see that. I can see where you're going with that. So, how has the bard changed then? Because of course, like we say now, so the bard, of course, has gone through the traditional stereotype bard. You're going to come across perhaps in history, it's going to be the guy in the pub, playing the flute. There's going to be a big skirt, as we've been talking about. So, how do you think it changed from being the character who I guess was probably the most important person at one time of genealogy, of history? Mm-hmm. Do you think that stopped when the written word came along? So in that sense that they weren't needed as much because you could chronicle it.
They weren't needed as much, but that only works if everybody could read.
Yeah.
Everybody could read and write.
Well, I guess people in the UK didn't know. In the United Kingdom didn't really know how to read and write until, I guess, 1600s. It was obviously still a very priestly thing, a very high nobles only, and I guess a few select people throughout the world, throughout the UK. Sorry. So I guess it would have been important to still have a bard or a town crier. Do you think they're the same thing?
A town crier is pretty much the news of the town, and just to announce events. It was an announcer, so they would be announcing, here's the Lord Mayor's parade, or everything is well at this time, or they would give off that. They were like the headliners of the day. They didn't have newspapers until, what was it, 1700s or something like that. So it was actually the town crier's job to inform of local news around that time. So maybe in a way that was kind of similar to bardistry, but at the same time that's just an oral tradition, and that's just of the informing the people. Whereas you would have still had, they probably weren't called bards, they're probably more just called players or musicians. In fact, I would say probably the bard kind of, I'll use that word, devolved, for probably lack of a better term. So the bard went from this quite high status poet with even travelling storyteller and news informer. They probably devolve into travelling musician or entertainer.
I guess with the stories of legend and mythology and history and imagination, of course, because we're still imagining, we still made stuff up.
Yeah, we still do. I mean, the one thing that I often find quite strange in pagan communities and pagan societies, and especially when you see it online as well, is when, frankly, not every pagan says this, but you still get those that do, are things like, damn the Christians for taking our taking our traditions and turning it into something else. And well, actually, if it wasn't for the monks and wasn't for certain chapels writing all the old stories down, we probably wouldn't even remember them at all. So if anything, we actually owe the church a bit of a debt there, because they actually retained those old stories. Okay, they probably didn't understand them as much as the people who told them would have done, but they wrote them down regardless, wrote them down nonetheless. So, in a way, when you said about did a written word help kill off the bard, not necessarily, because I think the noise would have got diluted. Folk tales all across the country, if you actually collect them, or if you actually put them together, you'll get quite a lot of folk stories that don't match, and there are just regional areas of telling a certain story or telling a certain thing. But there are some that actually reflect stories of old and were passed on from old time. That sounds so stupid, but passed on from older times. Like, for example, I was looking into a story from the Isle of Man, which is about an old hag who took on a servant girl and told her not to look at the chimney, and it turned out the little girl looked at the chimney and found a bag of gold, and that was a temptation. Nottingham has its own story of that, about a old hag who takes on a little girl to do some household duties and chores, tells her not to look at the chimney, finds a bag of money up there. And it's like, hang on a minute, Nottingham, this city which is descended from, say, Anglo-Saxon peoples, has actually a comparable story with one from the Isle of Man, which is a Celtic country. So either there's certain folk stories that have a similar story, a similar thread to them that just get passed around. But still, the written word, yes, it would have contained a nugget of information there, but really, it's the little things that people tell each other. Like, for example, it was folklore that when you heard the cuckoo, that's when you knew summer began. So you'd actually get little bits and nuggets of information from what people just tell each other. Maybe they did make it up, maybe it was just something they just made up to that was just for entertainment purposes. But I think there's something in there that's a little bit more arcane than that. No, not even arcane, archaic, sorry. So I think there are things that people knew that they just had to put on in story form anyway, because it's a lot easier to digest mentally.
Yes, it is. You can tell people facts and bullet points, but ultimately if you tell them a story, it's more memorable because you remember point to point, he went there, he did this.
Yeah.
That's where, in a bullet point list, this is where he did all these things. It's quickly forgotten.
Yeah.
Okay, so looking at, say, bardic traditions now, how is, say, that evolved? So we've gone from this poet, historian, genealogist who, of course, remembered all the history of his local towns and his history. That's now evolved through the time of the written word. It struggled to survive, I guess. It has survived. It took on its stereotype form.
Yeah.
So what is the position it is in now? Because I guess we're going to talk a bit more about its arcane form too, in regards to how what are lines of magic, should we say? But besides that, what's the bard's role now? What do they do now?
What does the bard's role now in the 21st century? Realistically, when you look at the 21st century, there isn't a role for it. There isn't a need for it. But I just love the idea you've got these people going around that are still doing it. It's like saying, yep, you've got your iPods, you've got your podcasts, you've got your computers with internet access, you've got your books, but we're still doing it. We're still going around, we're learning these things in our heads and with our voices. and we're telling you these stories. We're not just reciting it from a book. It's not a screen that you can just read it off, even though I do those things, but that's where I get my knowledge from. But it's putting it out there, it's performing it. You know, there's a difference between reading a tale from a book and a computer screen and performing it. Because in a strange kind of way, it's almost like you're making that magic happen. It's like you're using it's not like you are using your voice, you're using your mannerisms, you're using like right now I'm gesticulating. Of course, anybody listening to this can't see it, but I am. And you're sharing something with people, and you're even taking them, in a way, you're kind of taking them back to another time, another place, even another world. But you're doing that. You're using your... For the record, there are lights flickering as I'm talking about this, therefore it must be true. You are taking people to other places, but you're using their minds to help think about it, which I think, strangely enough, I think I've answered that very question, which is, what is the role of the 21st century bard? It's to help people remember. It's helping people remember their own history. It's also had to help people remember that there were times where life was dangerous. And actually, we take things for granted nowadays.
Like books, like the internet.
Like books, like the internet, because as we were discussing quite a few hours earlier, not everybody could read. Not everybody could just pick up a book and read it and say, oh, that's the story of this, that and the other. No. You have to depend on listening to songs to do that. You have to depend on people telling you.
I guess, yeah, when you look at, say, if you're a researcher or a historical researcher, certainly, you need to go find the books. You need to go find the oral traditions. You need to go find who knows that information.
Yeah.
Where is it written down? Who wrote it down? Why they wrote it down? Because that becomes your synopsis. That becomes part of your conclusion of what it is you're writing about. And of course, you know, you can go to Wikipedia, you can go to various news sources online. Before that happened, of course, you had to go to the library. You had to order books. You had to be talking to certain people. You had to be ordering books online, by post. You know, you had to be certain members of certain circles to get information come to you to be shared historically.
Even if I've got a book and I want to find more information about, like, for example, if I find a story that I think there's got to be more to it than that, you know, this is obviously just the skeleton of the story that the author has put there. Is there more detail? So I will actually either cross-reference another book, or I'll go on the internet and try and find another variation of the story.
Yeah.
And I'll mix them up, because I think that's what storytellers do. You know, one person's tale might echo another person's tale, but that other person's tale has got something that the other one hasn't. And if you combine bits and pieces, you're actually making the story a bit more complete, at least in my mind, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you find that certainly across all ancient books, you'll find text, and you'll find another version of the text that is often the same story, either fleshed out or lesser. So you can kind of tell which one was older, which one was newer. They often reference in times that happened, such as, I don't know, they had a famine or something, and you find lots of references to that occurrence in those sort of books, so you can kind of go, I know when this book occurred, I know when this story evolved, and I can see this piece that's been added here and there from around that area, so I can then place it in a certain part of history, a certain time in history. I know what occurred, I know who else occurred around there. And I find that's really fascinating about history, and that's really, really important. So let's kind of change the direction here. Okay. So talking about history then, and putting it into historical context. So bards, as we've talked about, they have evolved through time. They've changed, and their position right now is a rebellious one.
Yeah. It's almost like they're saying, kind of like, F you, we're doing our old tradition. Here's you with your electronic stuff. You can have that. We'll do this.
So when I was looking at the Druidic paths of those who follow, you know, that particular path of paganism, of Druidism, or Druidry, sorry, you find they have 3 levels of development throughout magical history and through their occult practices. And of course, one of those is Bard, being a Bard. Yeah. So, but now looking at it in the context that we've just spoke about, I can see now why that was considered to be a secret because that's how you told stories. That's how your lineage continued, because you had to tell a story in that way, or you had to remember your. So when we're talking about genealogy just there, and family history, that's why it was important to have Bard in that magical circle practice, not necessarily in the Society of Secrets or the Secret Societies. No, but in the sense actually you needed people, you needed the ability to memorize, you needed to know that you needed to remember stuff. So it makes sense, you know. Before you start writing stuff down, you had to have a group of people who actually had good memories, who could tell stories, who could remember those ancient stories, and that's why it was important. So, but why do you think there is actually the concept that you have to study being a bard in those secret channels, as it were? Do you think that's the only reason they had them, or do you think there's other reasons why they had bardry, bardism, whatever you want to call it?
Bardistry, bardism.
That,
Bardics.
do you think that's the reason why the Druid path has those 3 set paths that you have to learn?
Well, those 3 paths are certainly true of the Druid Order of the Bards, Ovates and Druids, which I'm a member of. Whereas there are other Druid paths and organisations which don't have those. The reason is that when you look at the old account, and I've already said that, but I'll say it again, when you look at the supposed history of Druids, from the Greek and Roman understanding, they wrote the word Druid down because they weren't entirely sure what it was to classify what these people were doing. There were 3 kinds. There was the Bardas, which is, for all intents and purposes, a form of poet in our language. I think the actual translation is something a bit more complex than that. There was the Fili, who were definitely poets. So there's already a bit of a difference there. There's something like orator in Bardas, and then there's poet in Vili, and then there was, if I can pronounce this right, Druidcraft, which is Druidcraft. The difference between those 3 is that it's almost like one's orator, as in like just for, I wouldn't say just for entertainment purposes, but maybe they kept the genealogy. So you got someone specialising in genealogy. And then you had the Vili, which is where the Roman word for Vatis, which is now what we call Ovates, comes in, which is definitely poet, which means they had a lot more knowledge and a lot more magical knowledge as well. Druid, as far as we can see, was basically a philosopher. And they were, I suppose you could say, the philosopher and scientist of their day. How that translates now, especially in the Order, is that the Bard is a creative exploration of yourself. So you don't just join the Order and then go straight to the Druid level, because realistically you can't do that. How can you be a Druid if you don't know yourself? So the modern interpretation of Druid is a mixture of storyteller, of seer and healer, and of philosopher, as well as working in the social world as well. Peacekeeper is what the Obod's definition of what the word Druid is, because the Druid was actually allowed to go from one tribe to another without being attacked. It was illegal to attack a Druid. Even in battle, when the battle's going on, the Druid was the only one who could actually go in between the 2 opposing forces and say, "Stop what the hell are you doing?" and just stop and think. So how it classifies now in the Order is that the Bard is, you start at the Bardic level, which is where I am, where you're exploring your creative self, and at the same time you're exploring your inner self. So it's almost like to take on the Bardic role, you actually need to go right deep inside your own self in terms of your own spirituality, your own psychology, even your own lifestyle. Find out who it is you actually are, and find what you use your strengths, what actually you're really good at, as well as what are the things you don't like about yourself, what are the things that you're too afraid to admit to yourself, and how it's not a case of eliminating and getting rid of that, it's more of how you come to terms with that. and you're allowed to express that in any creative endeavour that you see fit. Not every bard at the bardic level takes on storytelling. They don't take on music. They don't take on... It's encouraged because it's a creative outlet. But for someone else, it might be drawing. For someone else, it might be...
painting and so on.
Yeah, painting. Or it could even be planting something. It could actually be something quite physical. So, for example, someone who doesn't have no creative talent whatsoever, well, they like it when they make their garden this way, so you get those colours coming through. Fine. What I would really like to see is anybody who can do some kind of bardic wrapping.
Bardic wrapping.
Bardic wrapping. Could you imagine that? Like a 21st century version of bardistry, but using wrapping as an art form. I think that would be brilliant. I wouldn't dare try it.
Hip-hop bard.
Yeah.
Almost see some kind of like white guy wearing shorts, dressed in like a hood, just breaking it down in the street hip-hop style.
Yeah. The Ovate level is where it's where people usually want to be. It's when for people who come to the order, they say, "Oh well, I'm not really interested in the bard level. Can I just?" And I've learned witchcraft here before and stuff. Can I just go straight to the Ovate level? No, you can't. Because how can you go there? Start working with seeing patterns of divination and working with the force, as it were. If you don't know what you're doing and if you don't know who you actually are, you need to know yourself before you can start going on to that. So the Ovate grade looks into divination, it looks into working with magic, it looks into, at least so I understand, but I'm not there yet so I can't say. And it also looks into healing as well, as far as I understand. The Druid level looks into philosophy. It also looks into what good can you bring the community. So it's a lot more community work as well. So definitely that sense of keeping peace and what you do to promote that peace. So what does that mean in the 21st century? Well, I think when you look at the world around us, we need more peacekeepers.
Yeah, everyone's stepping away and go, you've got to stop doing this. You need to bring a bit of reason to this situation, as opposed to acting on impulse or acting on out of tradition. Or even acting out of revenge and emotion. You need to say, look, come on. You have to use your logic here, use some reason, use some understanding which we've had thousands of years knowledge of. Why are we choosing to make these quite daft decisions when there's better decisions to be made? Yeah. Can you use yourself? Can you use your better judgment to perhaps guide the people to make a better judgment? So yeah, maybe that is the point of a bard today.
Perhaps so. But I think there are a few things that we would, I wouldn't say we would dare try and copy living in the past, but in nowadays. For some people, they actually do that. They actually go into reenactment camps and want to learn how the old people did it and stuff. But let's be honest, we don't live in those times.
No. So, do you think it's relevant that people should? Or do they just want the experience, or they actually have a fantasy that perhaps they want to be a medieval knight, as it were, or they want to be swinging a mace on a battlefield, or is it just for the thrill of it? They don't really want to, so they're just exploring that part of themselves.
Yeah.
But, and that's all they're getting out of it, they're just exploring a fantasy. But they're not really doing anything with it. I mean, is that what you mean, or?
Not really. I was just thinking more of that there are some... Okay, actually no, I think you're right. I think there are actually some people who want to live in a fantasy world. To them the connection with nature harkens back to a golden age that never happened. For some people who believe that man and nature were one and we were divine beings. We were not. We were at war with nature. It was us. It was us against the world. It was a case of, well, we don't want to go into those woods because we know there are bears and wolves in there. If we go in there, they're going to rip us to shreds. So we build up fortifications, we make spears, we make weapons, and we defend ourselves.
I guess then you have the situation again. There's other people doing that as well.
And there's other people doing that as well.
If you're out hunting or you're out gathering food or you're planting food, there's another group of people over there who are also doing the same thing. And eventually, you're going to start planting food in the same place.
Yeah.
Or you want to make...
And if it wasn't the creatures that killed you, nature probably would have done. You
Well,
know?
the environment, yeah.
Yeah, winter was a harsh. We forget in our 21st century world that winter is was an extremely harsh time where you literally could die if you did not have enough grain, if you did not have enough harvest from your crop growing, or if the gods forbid that you actually had no crop at all because it died because of some kind of fungus poisoning, you were screwed. Your whole people were screwed. Which meant, obviously, there are people that you knew and loved and defended would have had to die of starvation or of disease because there's no food source. There were harsh times. So, going back to the camp thing, and no way am I actually saying or advocating we do have a war on nature, not at all. Nature is that wonderful goddess form of duplicity. On one hand she gives, but we must remember she takes. Simple as that. But I'm going back to what we were saying about the camps thing. I actually like the idea of the camps, to be fair. I think there are those who actually get caught up in the fantasy, a bit like what you were saying. I want to be a medieval knight and throw, spin my mace and smash into someone's head. Let's go around clubbing each other with these great big metal sticks called swords and shatter some spears. Be honest, who hasn't thought that once in a while?
Well, yeah, we've all done it.
Exactly, but I think it's actually a great way of connecting with the past in that way that it's healthy, in that way of, okay, what if we actually did this thing in school, right, where, okay, here we all are, living in our 21st century lives, aren't we lucky, la la la, right, but for an entire week, you have to live like this. You could probably do that in schools or something like that, where you could actually get the entire class living like a medieval village, just for 1 week. Okay, they'll probably end up whining about it and stuff, but I reckon there will at least be a good number of those.
I don't know if they would whine about it, because I think it's like kids going to camp. Kids love making fires, in a good way. Kids also like that experience of being outdoors. They like that feeling of... I think it calms people down, actually. Well, it also gets them in order in a different way.
Absolutely. I was getting there. Which is, I think that at least a good percentage of those kids will actually really appreciate it. Were you ever a member of the Scouts? Or...
I wasn't, no.
You weren't? I was. And I enjoyed it. And I think, at least at some point, everyone should camp. I don't mean glamping, none like that. I mean properly, just get down with the ground and learn from the land around you. And actually just experience that whole thing of, well, you don't have a running shower, you don't have hot water on tap, you don't have electronic things in your face. All you've got are the people around you, the things that you've got with you, i.e. tools, and the food that you have to eat, which either has to be sourced by buying it in advance and having to ration yourself down, or you have to get your food through other means, i.e. killing to eat.
That's it, or that's taking it off someone else.
Or taking it off someone else.
There's a village over the hill, our food stores have gone.
Yeah.
It's a matter of survival.
Yeah.
We have to go get theirs.
Yeah, which of course has how tribal war starts. But that kind of, it's that mentality, isn't it? Or, the other approach is, well, that village has got food, that village has got this. What have we got? Yeah. What can we trade for that? Which would be the probably more economic way of doing it, really.
And the bartering.
And the bartering, yeah. But when you've got that kind of environment, what have you got at night? Apart from the cold and the stars, depending on the time of year you're at. Well, you've got the opportunity to make a campfire where you can all sit around and tell stories and sing songs, and again, old tradition comes out. And that's why I say, to me, it's primal, because there's something very powerful about being sat around in a fire, sharing your food and your drink, and at the same time, listening to stories that take you somewhere else. And to me, that's magic.
It's true. I think we'll draw this to close in a moment, but it is true. When you're around a fire, when you're with other people,
Yeah.
there is a very comforting feeling that you don't get sat around in the living room gas fire, or even if you sat at the pub with your friends.
Yep.
It's not the same. When you sat around a fire outside...
It's a different thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So even in the family home, of course, the fire has been replaced by the television that tells the stories.
Yes.
Or the radio, say, 50 years ago. Not that it still doesn't exist today, but certainly in a reduced form. That's changed. You have all these media forms that come to you. But if you leave the living room, you go outside, you go into the garden, particularly, say, when you have bonfire night, everyone comes to your house. You have a barbecue, everyone surrounds the barbecue. And that social interaction re-begins again, and everyone generally has a good time. So there is something to be said about having, fire time.
Yes. Yes. And I think, in a strange kind of way, when you look at it, the 21st century is all about segregation. It's about categorizing what's this and what's that. How's that different from this and that? And the way that we live, the way that we actually interact with each other is actually segregated. You go into a bus and you see other people on the bus. How many of those people are just staring at their mobile phones in their own world? Probably communicating with other people, just not the ones next to them.
Yeah, there is a disconnection from each other.
Yeah. Whereas when you get the situation where you have to band together and you have to talk to each other and you have to share what you have with other people, I think there's actually something very human in that. There's something very comforting in that. And so one other thing about that, sitting around a fire, is that it's also a sense of community, a sense of pride. And that, as much as we get the words community hall or community this or community that, is actually what's missing from the 21st century. Because it's all about the individual, not about the group.
Okay, that's what we shall draw to a close this evening.